Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the sad and tragic story of John Crow and the murder of Margaret Crow, which took place in Gateshead in 1869. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. It is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money at all, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. John Crow was born in around 1802 in Gateshead to parents William and Eleanor. He married Margaret in the 1820s. The exact date is not entirely clear, but it was possibly 1825, and the couple had at least 9 children together. John worked as a shoemaker with a shop in Half Moon Lane in Gateshead. John was said to be well respected in the Gateshead area, described by many as a quiet, unoffensive man. Some reports of the time also suggest that John was suffering from a heart condition, although they did not say what this condition was. Margaret Crow, the victim, was born in Scotland in around 1804. Her parents are unknown. She had been married to John for over 40 years at the time of her death. She is described in later years as being a heavy drinker, and the couple are frequently heard to argue. It seems unclear when this began, as John simply suggests that things had been bad for several years. On Wednesday, August the 11th, 1869, around lunchtime, the neighbours in Edward Street in Gateshead heard John and Margaret arguing loudly. A few minutes later, Margaret went into her neighbour's house. She was quite drunk at the time. John followed her in and told the neighbour, a lady by the name of Jane Connell, that he had come home from work for his dinner, but it wasn't ready. He said it was never ready. He asked Margaret to give him the meat and he would make it himself. She threw the meat down onto the table and took hold of the poker from the fireplace and told John she would fettle him with it. Jane told her she must not do that. John picked up the meat and left, leaving Margaret sitting in a chair. She sat for a while, then left, and all was quiet. Around 10:30 p.m. on the same day, Jane again heard the couple arguing. The noise seemed to be coming from outside, and she heard Margaret shout out, "Oh dear." Jane went into her front room and looked out. She saw someone carrying Margaret into the house. She went out to help. When Margaret was put to bed, she noticed that she was bleeding badly from a wound on her leg. The police and a doctor were sent for. PC Hewitt charged John with cutting and wounding his wife, and he was taken to the police station. When Dr. Bannon arrived, he found Margaret in bed. The wound to her leg had now stopped bleeding. However, she had lost a great deal of blood and was very weak, and Margaret died just after 1 a.m. on August the 12th. John Crow was then charged with the willful murder of his wife. Just prior to the inquest, John Crow was taken before the magistrates at Gateshead. It was said that he appeared to be showing signs of great suffering from the short time that he had been in custody, and he had to be helped into the dock by the officers who had brought him into court. This was a simple hearing, just to allow a week's remand to be put in place until the outcome of the inquest was known. The inquest was held at the Gateshead Police Courts before Coroner Fable. Jane Connell said she had identified the body as being that of Margaret Crow, her neighbour in Edward Street in Gateshead, who she had known for several years. She said she was around 64 years old. Jane said on August the 11th around 12:30 lunchtime she had heard the couple arguing in their home. She said just after this Margaret came into her home with some meat wrapped in her apron. She was very drunk at the time. John followed her in a few moments later. He told her he had come for his dinner to find it was not ready for him. He added that there had been no dinner or tea ready for him now for several days. Jane said he asked Margaret to give him the meat, and she said she picked up the poker from the fireplace and threatened to hit it with him. Jane said she told her she must not do that, and Margaret then threw the meat onto the table and John picked it up and left. She said John did not threaten his wife in any way. In fact, she had never known him to be abusive to his wife, although she did know that they frequently argued. She said Margaret sat for 2 or 3 minutes and then left. She did not hear any more from the couple that afternoon. At around 10:30 p.m, Jane said she heard the sounds of an argument which seemed to be coming from outside. She thought she heard Margaret shout, "Oh dear," twice. She then went to her front room and looked outside. She could see someone trying to carry Margaret into the house. She said John was helping to carry her. She went outside and noticed blood on the path leading to the door, but at the time she did not know where it had come from. She went into their house, and when Margaret was placed on the bed, she could see she was bleeding badly, so a doctor and the police were sent for. She said when Inspector Hewitt arrived, he placed cold wet cloths on the wound, and this did seem to slow the bleeding until the doctor arrived. However, there was not much that could be done for her, and she said she was with her until her death at around 1 p.m. She said Margaret had told her, "I am dying," and she had told her she hoped not yet. When asked, she said she had never known John to be drunk, and she had known him for around 10 years. As far as she could tell, he had been sober on the night of the crime. She had never known him to threaten or hit his wife. However, she had often heard Margaret threaten John, and she was also often very drunk. Jane said Margaret often came into her house, but not when she had been drinking, as she knew that she did not like to see her when she had been drinking. She said John frequently complained that his meals were never ready for him when he came home from work. Mary Crabtree said she lived in the house opposite the Crows in Gateshead. She said on the night of the 11th she heard John come home around 10 p.m, and after this she heard the couple arguing. She heard Margaret cry out, "Oh dear," and she thought she had gone outside into the street. Mary said she took no more notice until around 10 minutes later, when her husband came home and told her Margaret was lying in the street drunk. She said she looked outside and saw 2 people carrying her into the house. She said she did not go over and knew no more after that. When asked, she said she often heard the couple argue, usually when Margaret was drunk, which she said was often. She said she had never known John to be drunk. She said she had sometimes heard him tell his wife to be quiet and keep the peace, but she had never heard him be abusive to her or threaten her in any way. And she said she had often heard John say he had come home for his meal to find none ready and no fire lit. Jane Scott said she also lived in Edward Street in Gateshead. She said she also lived in a house opposite the Crows. She said on the night of the 11th she was going to her window when she noticed people outside in the street at Mrs. Crow's door. She went out and went over and saw Margaret lying on the ground. She said she got John to help her carry her inside. She said she saw a lot of blood outside and also inside the house. John did not say anything about what had happened. She said when Inspector Hewitt charged John with cutting and wounding, she heard him say that he knew he had thrown the knife at her. She did not hear him say anything else. She added that she had often helped Margaret into the house when she'd been found drunk in the street, and she'd often seen her drunk, but she had never seen John under the influence, only perhaps on one occasion. When asked, she said she had never heard John say anything to threaten his wife that night. She said she'd only ever heard him say that he would have a good wife if only she could stay sober. And she said on the night of the 11th John was sober to the best of her knowledge, and she did not hear him accuse his wife of attacking him with the knife first that night. Inspector Hewitt said, acting on information received, he had gone to the Crow's house just after 10:30 on the 11th. He had found Margaret lying on the bed and John was sitting on another close by. Margaret was bleeding badly and her clothes were soaked in blood. He said he sent P.C. Watson to fetch Dr. Bannon. While he waited for the doctor to arrive, he said he had applied wet bandages to the wound on her thigh, which had slowly stopped the bleeding. He said he had charged John with cutting and wounding his wife, and John had replied saying, "I came in and there was no dinner for me. She took a knife to me. She was drunk at the time. When I came home that night, there was still nothing ready for me. I did take the knife, and I am sorry for it. It's a bad job, but it cannot be helped now. I had better be dead than in such misery." Inspector Hewitt said he had then searched the house and had found the knife, which was shown to the jury, in the back room on a table. No effort had been made to hide it, and it was covered in fresh blood. Around the room, he said he also found lots of blood in various different places. And after the death of Margaret Crow, he said John had been charged with her murder, to which he had replied, "I will say nothing." He did add, however, that on account of John's heart problems, he had not told him of his wife's death immediately after it happened, as he did not want to make him ill. Dr. Bannon said he had been called to the house by P.C. Watson on the night of the 11th. He said he found Margaret lying on the bed, and the bleeding had now stopped, but she had lost a very large amount of blood and was very weak. He said she had died at around 1 a.m. the following morning. He said with the help of Dr. Barkus, he had also performed the post-mortem on the body of Margaret Crow. He said the wound to her thigh had been deep enough to touch the bone. It was his professional opinion that the cause of death had been blood loss due to this wound. He also added that if Margaret had been running around from the inside of the house to the outside after she had received the injury, this would have caused it to bleed more heavily. Also, it was possible that she would have bled more easily due to being drunk at the time. John had not been present at the inquest until after the doctor's statement. When he was brought into the room, he was told the details of the inquest so far would be read to him, and he would be allowed to make a statement if he wished to do so. However, once all the witness details had been read to him, he said he had nothing at all to say. The coroner then spoke to the jury, stating that it was quite clear that John had been the cause of his wife's death. However, it was for them to decide if this had been a case of deliberately taking a knife and stabbing his wife in the leg, or if it had been a case of a heated argument, and in the confusion, the wound had been unintentionally inflicted. They must also decide if there had been enough evidence to prove provocation to reduce the charge to one of manslaughter. The jury retired for 20 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against John Crow, and he was committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for Margaret Crow. Sadly, they are not always covered in great detail in the papers at the time, as the actual inquest and trial seemed to be covered in a lot more detail. It's not clear if the family had money or not, so it's hard to know if this would have been a pauper's funeral or not, but I would imagine that it possibly was. I did not find any details of any family for Margaret in the area, so it's likely that only her children would have been responsible for her burial. I did not find any details of a headstone for Margaret anywhere in the area. Although I was unable to find out why there was such a long delay, the trial was not held until February of 1870 at Durham before Mr. Justice Wiles. It is possible that since the incident John may have been unwell and time may have been allowed for him to recover before a trial. John pleaded not guilty to the charge of manslaughter. As is often the case, the evidence at the trial was almost exactly the same as that given at the inquest, so I will only include any new details. Dr. Bannon gave the same evidence as at the inquest, only adding that had Margaret kept still and quiet after she had been stabbed, it is possible she would have survived, as the bleeding had stopped after she had been put to bed, and the wound would have then been able to have been taken care of. He also stated that it was possible that the wound could have been caused by Margaret falling towards the knife in her drunken state while it was still in John's hands. The defence spoke to the jury, suggesting to them the possibility that John had not stabbed his wife at all. He said, was it not possible that after Margaret had threatened him, he had picked up the knife, afraid of what she might do, and in her drunken state she had stumbled and fallen onto it, or ran towards him and ran into it. It was, after all, a strange place for someone to stab another with intent to kill. He added that there had been no evidence to suggest that John had ever ill-used his wife, but had in fact suffered at her hands for many years. He asked them to consider that while the stab wound had been the cause of her death, that it may have been inflicted by accident. He then called for several witnesses to speak of the character of John Crow. Mr. Riot, Mr. Henderson and Mr. Hunter all spoke of having known John for years, some as many as 30 years, and all said he was a quiet, inoffensive man who they had never known to show any signs of violence towards his wife. I did not find any details of the prosecution summing up. However, I am sure that we can assume that he would have dismissed the idea of an accident, perhaps suggesting that John had simply snapped and stabbed his wife in a fit of temper. The judge addressed the jury, stating that it was for them to decide if John had simply taken up the knife and stabbed his wife, or if she had fallen towards it while he had been holding it in his hand. He noted that the doctor had given evidence to suggest that this latter part was possible in her drunken state. He stated that it had been made clear to them that Margaret had not been a good wife to John for many years. However, this did not give John the right to attack her, and if they thought this was the case, then they must find him guilty of murder. If, however, they felt there was any doubt, then manslaughter should be their verdict. He did not at any time suggest that they should find John not guilty. The jury, after retiring for only a few minutes, returned a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against John Crow. The judge, addressing John, said it was clear that Margaret's death had been caused by the knife blow to her leg, and that the jury had found him responsible for that. He understood that there had been great provocation, and that John had been of previous good character, but a sentence still had to be passed, and he would sentence John to 5 years penal servitude. It would seem that John made no reply to this and was removed from the dock and returned to Durham prison. Shortly after this, a petition was set up by many well-known people of Gateshead in the hope of changing the sentence and allowing John to be freed from prison. It was said to have been signed by some 2,500 people, including the mayor and several magistrates. However, this was unsuccessful and the sentence was not revoked. However, John would not end up serving the 5-year sentence, as shortly after receiving the news that the petition had been unsuccessful, he died in Durham prison. It was stated at the time that he had been unwell, although no further details were given, and I did not find any evidence of a headstone for John Crow in the area, nor did I find any details of a funeral. This was a very sad case. It seems to me that John had spent many years living with the abuse from his wife, almost always at times when she was under the influence of drink, and it sadly does seem that she was drunk more than she was sober. There is certainly evidence from the witnesses at the inquest to state that Margaret had been heard to threaten John on many occasions. The night in question is difficult to work out though, as no one but John and Margaret were present at the time the fatal blow was struck, and John at no point in time suggested that Margaret had fallen onto the knife, but it has to be said that he never admitted to stabbing her himself either. So how she came to have the wound to her leg is really unknown. Based on the evidence they had, it seems the jury had no choice but to return a verdict of manslaughter, as there was not enough evidence to prove that it was an accident. The judge, it seems, did have some sympathy towards John though, resulting in the low 5-year prison term. I personally can't say for sure if I think John was guilty or not. I do believe he had a hard life with his drunken wife, but I cannot be sure if this was an accident or if he finally snapped and stabbed her in a moment of anger. Although I do admit, stabbing her in the leg does seem to be an odd place for someone who wants to kill their wife. So thinking of it in that way, it does seem to lean more towards it being an accident. What is certain is that John was liked enough for the people of the town to try and get his sentence overturned and get him freed from prison. This does to me suggest he was a man who was not known for being violent towards his wife, as anyone who had previously abused his wife would have not been given any thought by the people of the town after the trial had ended. But what do you think? Do you think it is possible that Margaret was so drunk that she simply fell or ran into the knife while John was holding it? Or do you think he simply lost his temper after years of abuse and lashed out at her with the knife? Do you think the jury was correct to find him guilty of manslaughter? Or do you think that they should have found him not guilty? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Before I go, I just want to add one small thing. Many of these stories that I cover talk about the crime taking place and the victim shouting out, "Oh dear." And while I do put these words into the story, I have to wonder if they are truly the words that were spoken at the time. What do you think? As I am sure the words would have been something much stronger than "oh dear." I do hope that you have found this very sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.